Good morning and welcome to the decision session for the Executive Member for Economy and Strategic Planning on Tuesday the 26th of January. I shall go through the agenda as printed. Item 1, declarations of interest. There are no items that are not already declared by myself on the Council's register of interests in relation to the business today. Item 2, minutes of the meeting held on the 22nd of December. I'm approving those and we'll sign those when we are in a position to do such things. Item 3, public participation. I do not have any registered speakers for this meeting. So that then brings us on to item 4, which is the economic strategy update, which I believe Alex, you are leading on this morning.
I'll just introduce,
and then
if that's okay.
Right, so you're Simon, if you introduce it, and then we cover those points. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Waller. Yeah, so the report you have in front of you is an update to the report we brought to your October 2020 decision session. And since then, we've also been to Economy in Place Scrutiny Committee in November to review our evidence base. The most important thing really to stress in terms of what we're saying in the report is, unfortunately, we've had to delay publishing the strategy. I mean, this is clearly in the midst of the current pandemic. It's a difficult time really to set a medium-term to long-term strategy. So I think there's much benefit just to delaying for a few months. And I think the other important thing to highlight is that really the point we're at in terms of strategy development is the point at which we really need to go out and do some much more detailed consultation with stakeholders in York. And again, that's particularly difficult, particularly in the current lockdown. We think if there's some relaxation, we'll be able to do that. Alex will talk us through the timeline we have and also give us a more detailed update. But I'd say the key thing is we had been hoping to bring a finished strategy to the Council Executive in perhaps May of this year. We're now saying actually we're going to need a few more months than that, and we are now talking about bringing it back in the autumn. We haven't defined exactly which meeting we'll bring it to. That will become clearer as it becomes clearer over the next few months how long the current lockdown is due to last. I say that those are really the key points, but I'd like now to bring in Alex, who will talk us through the detailed report that he's prepared on this.
Thanks, Simon.
Okay, thank you for that, Simon. Right, Alex.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Waller. So the report we took to your decision session in October was quite a comprehensive one, and it outlined the work that we were doing in developing our new economic strategy. And the report outlined our twin track approach to this new strategy. So first of all, to continue the long established focus on developing higher paid jobs in key sectors across York's economy, but also developing a clearer approach to inclusive growth across our economy as well in York. These two priorities will be underpinned by two cross-cutting themes: the notion of 21st century jobs built flexibly around the needs of our employees and supported by continuous learning, and also a focus on a green economic recovery, addressing the Council's low carbon commitments, but also the city's world-leading bioeconomy and agri-tech innovation assets. So as Simon has already mentioned, since that decision session in October, focus has been put on reviewing and refreshing our economic evidence base, which will underpin the development of the strategy. And we've got a draft of this evidence base which accompanies the report. So within that, we look at York's levels of productivity, our city's wage levels, our employment mix, the number of business startups in the city, our skill levels, which are very high in the north in comparison, and also our housing affordability. We also look at the economic impacts of COVID-19, and this has also been supplemented by the data that we bring to your quarterly economic updates, Councillor Waller, which also goes through some of the more recent economic data on the impact of COVID on our economy and also on our residents. Work has also been placed since October on start mapping out our engagement activity with businesses, residents and partner organisations, which will shape the content of our economic strategy for York. Obviously, the nature of the questions will differ according to their audience, but for businesses, we really want to understand the impact of the pandemic on their turnover, their workforce, their skill needs, and also their workspace requirements. We also want to understand what businesses perceive to be the advantages and disadvantages of doing business in York, and understand what support businesses need to aid recovery from the pandemic, but also medium to longer term growth as well. For residents, we want to better understand what they feel around the security of their job, what their career prospects are, and also those of their family in light of the pandemic. We also want to better understand attitudes to adult learning as well, and what skills residents would like to learn and develop to help them to adapt, to upskill, and also to potentially access new career opportunities. We also want to understand residents' experiences of employment in York. Those who are interested in self-employment, what are the barriers to setting up their own businesses, and also what support do the self-employed need to develop and grow their businesses as well. It's important to mention that this engagement work is not being done in isolation. We're also in discussion internally around how this engagement dovetails and informs separate planned engagement taking place across the Council's Economy and Place Directorate during this coming year. Now that includes the My City Centre project, Local Transport 4, climate change, and the Council Skills Plan. Finally, to conclude this summary of the report in front of you, Simon's already mentioned the fact that we are planning to delay engagement and the publication of our economic strategy due to the current impact of lockdown and what that has had on both the resource available in our team, given that a lot of emphasis has been placed on supporting businesses with accessing grants and also other queries. But also, as Simon mentioned before, we do feel that businesses at this moment in time will find it difficult to engage on matters regarding medium and long-term growth when the focus right now is on their business survival. Therefore, we are planning to engage with businesses on the economic strategy around the late spring, early summertime, and hopefully we will be taking a strategy to executive in the autumn for approval. That concludes a summary of the report, Councillor.
Okay, thank you for that. Just a couple of observations. I fully appreciate that we are at a stage of the pandemic where it is very difficult to conduct this work, let alone be certain that the audience is able to look at some of the long-term issues. And as Alex, you mentioned in the preamble, that many businesses are focusing on the day-to-day survival, and that clearly is a priority, and appreciate the work that you and the team have been putting into ensuring that support is provided to businesses as quickly as possible, and that York has been one of the leading authorities in ensuring that and in refining a limited local discretionary scheme. But I think that it does demonstrate that work is going ahead, that whilst the strategy has been postponed, it is not. It is at a time when you are all very, very busy doing the work that's necessary. Just wanted to touch on those activities that still absolutely need to happen for the long-term economic success of the city, ensuring, and I think I'll bring Neil in at this point, the major infrastructure developments across the nation, thinking particularly of rail, which is a key aspect to York's attraction for doing business, but ensuring that our voice is heard. My voice is very so that is still ongoing, and that those steps which are needed, particularly thinking of young people, that they're the steps that are needed to ensure that they are supported in their transition to work, that still goes ahead despite the changing timetable for this economic strategy. Neil, did you want to come in?
Yeah, so I think, as you rightly say, there's lots of ambition within government. Obviously, we've yet to see that translate into actual projects for capital delivery across the UK. So particularly of areas of interest for York, there's proposals for significant investment in carbon reduction, green jobs, and a major plank of our devolution ask to government for the new combined authority is about the ambition for the area to be a carbon negative area. So putting North Yorkshire in the forefront of the list from our perspective as to drawing down that national capital funding for investment in capital in green jobs and a sustainable carbon reduction. From a perspective of transport, we see the Transport for North proposals in terms of the outline business case has been submitted to government. And whilst government are obviously considering that at the moment, they also have announced the levelling up agenda. So one would hope that the ambitious plans for rail in the north of England will benefit from some of that levelling up funding, and particularly from a York perspective, with 6-7% of all rail interchange in the north of England. York is a relatively small city of 200,000 compared to the conurbation of Liverpool with over 1 million, and yet we have similar numbers in terms of rail transitions. So again, in terms of that rail investment, one would hope that York would see a good share come to the city. East Coast Main Line, again, investment in the East Coast Main Line is being considered for a number of years now, and that investment to the north of York, between York and Newcastle, has been highlighted as a top priority and an early win in terms of efficiencies of the East Coast Main Line. And obviously, the leader, Councillor Aspden, is chair of the East Coast Main Line authorities and lobbying hard to see that investment come to that route between York and Newcastle, a key economic route for us. So lots of capital investment expected in a variety of areas, and York is well placed to benefit from that. And I think, picking up on your final point, the transition for our young people into jobs in that capital programme is really important. And for example, the council doesn't just have the rhetoric, it follows up. So on the Guildhall, we have a placement from the York College, working with our contractor Vinci, and that has been maintained despite COVID. There was obviously a hiatus last March, but those arrangements have been put in place. And we're also, in terms of York Central, the John Sisk contract for the delivery of the infrastructure there also requires apprenticeships and placement in there. And in terms of the refurbishment programme and the rebuilding of a more sustainable housing stock, our own housing department and our newly funded or newly agreed to be funded housing upgrade, insulation upgrade programme will also include retrofit. That's the word I'm looking for. Thank you, Castle. That retrofit programme will also include apprenticeships. So yes, we're well placed to receive those capital funds, and I think we are embedding that transition from school to work within those programmes.
Okay, thank you for that. So looking at the recommendations, I note the content of the report. The draft economic evidence base and plans for engagement activity, and to agree to undertake business engagement activity on the Council's economic strategy in the late spring, early summer 2021. That's as printed. So what I would just add on to that is a request to maintain efforts to ensure that York's voice is heard on infrastructure programs nationally, that we maximise the use of government funding to be reported in the quarterly economic update, and that specifically work to assist young people into employment is given an emphasis in your endeavours. So those are the additional 3 points that I would include on. I accept that this work is ongoing. My additions are merely to have those recorded in the minutes, but I appreciate all the steps that are being taken to ensure that there is parallel working on this, whilst accepting the specifics of the timing of the strategy will be delayed slightly due to the inevitable consequences of where we are. So, okay.
And our intention is to bring you a further update to your April decision session.
Yeah, thank you.
On where we've got to. Thank you.
That's very helpful. Okay, thank you for that. So that brings us on to item 5, which is the consultation, latest government consultation on planning.
Good morning, Councillor Waller. Good morning, everyone else.
Good morning. So, Mike, are you leading on?
Just introduce the paper before then bringing
right,
Gareth
introduce.
in. So
right.
yes, it's another month, another consultation on planning reforms, I'm afraid. So this one, as you'll see from the paper, was started on the 3rd of December. It's gone over the Christmas period. It's a consultation with the title Supporting Housing Delivery and Public Service Infrastructure. It is a lot about housing, but there are some other things in here as well. There are 3 different elements to the reforms that are put forward here for the consultation. The first is a new permitted development rights for changes of use from the relatively new commercial, business and service use to residential use to create new dwellings, new homes. And Gareth's going to come into some detail after these on after me. The second one is measures to support public service infrastructure through the planning system, extending the permitted development rights for schools, colleges, universities and hospitals, but potentially then developing that further for prisons and MOD sites. And the final one, which is the least contentious perhaps, is a consolidation of some of the bits of legislation and the changes that have taken place over the last few years into a single document. So I think if I can now just bring Gareth in, Councillor Waller, we can perhaps just go through each of the main areas of reform, and then that leads us into perhaps consideration of the detailed questions and our draft responses that are set out in the paper before you. Thank you. Okay, Gareth's online.
Right, Gareth.
Good morning, Councillor Waller.
Good morning.
Mike has briefly gone through the headlines of the proposed changes. Apologies, used to my committee starting at 4:30, not 10 o'clock in the morning. So my voice getting sorted out.
Okay.
So there's, as Mike said, there's a new permitted development right, which proposes change of use from the new commercial, business and service use class to create new homes. Now that commercial, business and service use class is a wide-ranging new consolidated use class introduced from the 1st of September 2020. And that includes shops, restaurants, cafes, financial professional services offices, use for indoor sports and fitness, provision of health and medical services, creches, day centres, nurseries, and all offices, light industry that would be suitable in a residential area, and research and development uses. And the proposal there is to allow change of use to any number of residential units. It will be a prior approval use class right, so the applicants would be required to submit details of their proposal, subject to a fee of £96 per unit, and the authority is limited in terms of the scope of its consideration to just those issues that are set out in the order itself. The second strand of the proposals are for extended permitted development rights for schools, universities, hospitals, and introducing those rights to prisons and other criminal justice institutions. This permitted development right already exists, but the idea is to extend that right to allow for extensions of up to 25% of gross floor space, and that would cut in from the time the permitted development right was introduced. At the moment, that right only applies to a measurement of the original building, and obviously long-standing schools and institutions have long since used up the opportunity to introduce that right. So as I say, 25% of gross floor space or 250 square meters of floor space, whichever is the greater. There's a lower floor space for hospital uses. It also includes a proposal to increase the height limitation, which is currently 5 meters, up to 6 meters. The right includes limitations in terms of building close to boundaries, for example. Thirdly, there's a proposal to shorten the statutory period for determining major developments for public infrastructure bodies. So again, generally hospitals, prisons, schools. From the current 13 weeks to a proposed 10 weeks. And this also includes the proposal to reduce the public consultation period from the current 21 days down to 14 days. The government also suggests, as part of that use class right, a requirement for engagement in pre-application consultation. Fourthly, there's a proposal to consolidate the General Permitted Development Order, which is the document that contains the schedule of these permitted use rights. And that's in order to bring together both these new changes and all the other small scale changes that have taken place since the order was originally drafted in 2015. That's broadly what the proposal covers. If you wish to go through the proposed responses to the questions, or if you have any comments or questions at this point.
Right. I think if we go through, I think at this point what I'll do is to thank members of the public and the Chamber of Commerce and councillors for writing to me on this item, and really to recognise that it is particularly pertinent. Yesterday, Boohoo seemed to have purchased Debenhams with the intention of never opening any of their stores again, which is an event which I think would have been hard to predict 5 years ago. And I suppose is one of the motivators for this, for recognising the work that the authority has done in conjunction with Bill Grimsey on some of the work that he's done nationally in terms of stimulating the debate, let's say, on what happens to major retail centres that have moved away from the 1980s model that he was one of the key instigators of implementing, and he does recognise that. So I think if we come on to the detailed questions, I accept that there's quite a lot in this. So I think if I group them together, Gareth, if that helps,
yeah,
because I think with any change, councillors are faced with the public generally have their own understanding of the planning process, and they anticipate being able to be informed that something's coming, and to be able to comment, and they expect their local councillor in particular circumstances to be able to call into committee or whatever. Now, this is proposing changes that would reduce that democratic oversight, and I think what I would say is that many of the responses I've had has been to ensure that there's still the ability for local authorities to have a say on the planning process. So, Gareth, those are reflected in the answers provided, the draft answers provided.
yes. With the first permitted development right, permitted development rights already exist for certain uses to change to residential without the need for permission.
As a ward councillor, I discovered fairly early on that you can change from being a supermarket to a funeral parlour within the same class.
That's in the same use class, yeah.
Yeah, so that was quite a surprise.
And that's that right has been extended considerably with the new Class E use class, which I outlined before. With the permitted development right changes to residential, currently there, and as proposed in the paper, there are existing safeguards. So the authority has a right to comment, determine, refuse, seek amendments on schemes, on issues relating to flooding, transport, land contamination, noise impacts from commercial uses, provision of natural light, fire safety, impacts on use of on the proposed use on heavy industry, and waste disposal. And they're all issues that are proposed to be retained and expanded in terms of impact on natural light, for example, which isn't an existing consideration. There's also a proposal to require developers from I think it's April next year to comply with the national ascribed space standards when providing any housing unit through this particular change of use right. As part of our response to the consultation, we were suggesting that the impact of noise impacts was widened to include impacts of noise from transport uses.
Can I just pause you on that? We have, as an authority, had a debate within the city in terms of noise issues relating to live music venues. There can be a new development next door, which then threatens the viability of that activity that has been previously enjoyed by that venue. So are we able to include that as a consideration?
That's part of the government proposal to allow consideration of noise impacts from commercial uses on the change of use.
I was thinking more of an an existing use, which could be a factory, could be a live music venue, which has been perfectly reasonable, going about its business, and then a new development pops up next door, and then threatens the viability of that activity. I think
if I can just join in with this discussion, I think it's one of the potentially unintended consequences of the legislation, that you could have a situation that you introduce potentially a residential noise sensitive development next to a noise generator that's long established.
Yeah, so I think
you have issues of complaints.
So I think if we can reflect that in the written answers, Gareth, are you able to include that?
I think that's the thought process behind that inclusion of that caveat or limitation. That would certainly allow the authority to take that into account with an application for prior approval. There's also issues of potential issues of air quality which aren't covered by the proposals, and it's thought that as this is widened out, there's no limitation on numbers, there's no limitation on the size of premises that can be turned over to residential use. Then in areas of where we have air quality issues, then we feel that authorities should be able to take that into account and seek mitigation to address that particular issue.
Right. Okay.
There's part of our response talks about requiring the provision of adequate waste and recycling. We've always considered that's covered under the transport impacts that we can take into account at the moment, but if creating a new use classes, a new permitted development right, it wouldn't go amiss to make it explicit that we can cover that issue.
I think that's important to include, because when it isn't, you end up with all sorts of unintended waste and recycling receptacles dotted around the vista.
Yeah. And then finally, on this group of answers is the issue about whether we should retain safeguards in terms of trying to ensure that there's some public local planning authority input into the loss of retail and service uses to key shopping areas, and that's a really quite a challenging question at the moment because of the structural changes that you've already outlined are taking place in the retail industry. But there are concerns that those areas which are perhaps more attractive as residential within existing city and district centres may result in perhaps a further hollowing out of the retail and service offer without any control. The existing permitted development rights.
Can we focus on that? And I'd like to bring Mike in as well. I think just considering the various national government responses to the high street, which are very much about drawing together retail, the remaining retail in an area to retain footfall, vibrancy, everything else. So Gareth, from what you're saying, there is the threat that we end up with pepper potting of the existing retail centre, so that you lose that critical mass of shops in a particular area that you draw people to. There may be other activities going on at the same time, and there's talks about GP practices, libraries, a whole raft of other activities that would draw people in. But So Gareth, are
Sorry,
you saying
yeah.
that there is the potential that we lose that critical mass?
Yes, at the moment, a permitted development right exists, has a limitation which allows the authority to consider the loss of retail and service uses to key shopping centres, and that's not proposed in this current right. Although I should add that which is a York specific thing, I guess, that there is a proposal for the right not to apply to ground floor uses in conservation areas.
That's I think that's if we can come back to that point, because I think it links in with what we've tried to do with York Central in the overarching consent for that to have activity at ground level rather than the old model of a shop, retail being on many floors, which seems to be falling out of favour.
If I can
Michael, Mike, if you can just deal with the issue of what we'd like to do is to follow these national guidance of let's concentrate the retail in a particular area. But this
takes us away, I think, in that we potentially have another unintended consequence. Most towns and cities across the country are shaped by planning policies that look for concentration of retail, and traditionally you have prime retail areas and then secondary where you have a mixture of areas. Clearly, post COVID, we may have a different situation if retail, as you say, is to be reducing the quantum of floor space. It would make sense still for co-location and concentrations within certain geographies. The danger we have here, I think, with the legislation, that you may get some areas where there's little change. You may get some areas where there's wholesale loss of some of the retail or commercial uses to residential, leaving isolated pockets of retail that then potentially become unviable because there isn't the same footfall or attraction by the numbers.
I think that would be a worry in York. So I was just coming back to the issue of ground floor use, because there isn't much reference in the government questions to saying, in the York context, there are lots of discussions about upper floors being used for accommodation, for office space, and that brings it into use. The carbon's already been spent on constructing it, so making use of it is actually a boon. But in some locations, we would want to retain that ground level retail activity. So are you able to, I would like to see that reflected in the answers that we provide as an authority, Gareth.
Okay, as written, we support they're not proposing it, they're asking the question whether we would support the control over ground floor uses in the change in the conservation area, and we're saying yes. We're also suggesting that outside the conservation areas, excuse me, that part of the prior approval considerations includes the loss of those retail and service uses and the impact on key shopping areas, which I think we would consider to be those which are shown as such in the local plan. Obviously, we will have to consider how things are going with structural changes, and I'm not quite sure how they would include that in a permitted development right. But perhaps it just needs to come alongside some changes to the MPPF.
But I think, in terms of we're giving a York response to this national consultation, therefore it's of particular concern to the makeup of this city that it benefits from there having been controls in the past, and we want to see a structured response to the change in retail, so that we keep areas viable. And notice near near to me. There's lots of in Front Street. A number of flats have been utilising space upstairs not being used, and so additional doors have been knocked in, and that's retained the shops at ground floor, but enabled the upper floors to be fully utilised, and that's a concept of regeneration in Coney Street that people are particularly interested in.
Yep.
Okay. Can we just come on to the issue of the housing that could be developed? There's been a representation for key worker accommodation, particularly in the city centre, and ensuring that these changes result in homes for people to live in, rather than a whole raft of Airbnb, which would not respond to the area's need for additional housing.
There's no limitation, as far as I can tell, within the permitted development right. It creates a residential unit within C3 of the use classes order, which is a single dwelling.
But we would be able to put in the council response that we would like to see this utilisation of space above shops as responding to particularly the affordable housing need in the city, and for the spaces to be utilised in that way if they're not.
We can. I think in our response we've mentioned that in areas like York we see that there may be a likelihood that these units are provided for visitor accommodation rather than accommodation for local people, local families. But as the legislation stands at the moment, there are no subcategories of residential accommodation. So you would be looking at an additional a change to the existing use classes order to accommodate.
I think in the response, what I personally feel, and I've received representations to do so, is in this response to say we would like to see legislation that achieves this. So just as towns and villages in the Lake District and in Cornwall are responding to the loss of accommodation resulting in young people having to move away, that we would join with that cause to say actually that there should be additional regulation that could be used.
We can certainly add that. That's not a problem.
That would be very helpful, right?
So just on the housing, so before we move on, Councillor Waller, perhaps, clearly one of the other issues is affordable housing. That again, the permitted development rights, there's no issue of affordable housing. Certainly some of the larger schemes or conversions, you potentially could seek a contribution or provision. So it's another area of concern, I think, in terms of
I think that there was considerable interest in affordable housing in the written representations that I've received. So I think it would be pertinent to include that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So the just working through the questions in groups. So Gareth, anything outstanding?
There is the question regarding. Sorry, I'm just trying to scroll down. Question 6.1, which is on the bottom of page 67 within the annex. And this is the question, it's an equalities question. Do you think the proposed right the change of use from commercial business service use class to residential could impact on business, communities or local authorities. And you recall that I outlined earlier that the change would, because of the wording of Class E, this change includes uses within for the provision of health, medical services, creche, day nurseries, day centres, and there's that potential. There's that potential for the loss of those uses to housing without that community input, which potentially puts our abilities to plan for such uses, which is supported by our local plan and supported by national policy, undermines it to some degree.
So I think we expressly need to include that in our representation.
Yes, sorry, that was question 6.2 rather than 6.1, which refers to people who share protected characteristics.
Yeah. But the point that you've put in the response relates to accessibility, and so just looking at that. So you're saying if there's a medical establishment, that there should be lifts put in, and that's not always possible in listed buildings.
I was accessibility in terms of the ease of reaching the premises rather than the ease of moving about the premises.
Right.
So I was thinking more about the accessible locations.
So it's the blue badge issue, is it?
It's the blue badge issue. It's the it's being served by a variety of bus routes and things like that, and the loss of those, just generally the loss of those facilities.
Right. We expect facilities to be within easy walking distance for many people, Andrew, and obviously otherwise, it's an unplanned, and you find then communities find those facilities are somewhat remote and difficult to get to, perhaps.
So I think what we should do is reflect in that we wouldn't want to be in a position where there's a drive for that all the dentists crowd into one location, which is very difficult to get to if you have a disability. So I think it's ensuring that there's access issues are considered, but I think that should be a dialogue with the CCG, that partners should be engaged with the overseeing the general provision of medical and health facilities, so that they're not all clustered in hard to reach places, that there are a number around the city. So I think that would be a requirement on other government departments to ensure that they oversee that aspect of it, and ensure there isn't an unintended consequence of this particular change in planning law. Does that help, Gareth?
Yeah. Okay.
Right. Okay. Right. Okay. So that's covered.
I think that now covers that. That's covered that first strand of the proposals. The next bit's probably a bit quicker. So this is the public infrastructure, the proposal to allow expansions of those schools, universities, and hospitals within those caveats. It's not, I guess, it's not potentially without consequence. I mean, most of these stand within an existing estate, and usually with reasonably significant grounds around them. So they do have the opportunity to absorb increased development. There are safeguards in place, as I said before, about building close to boundaries, about height. What there isn't, as far as I can see from the proposals, is any consideration of impact on parking provision. And whilst we obviously we have a general approach to try and try and introduce modal shift to people accessing these uses, we have seen issues about parking around these facilities.
Indeed.
And the potential for areas of existing car parking to be taken out to be used for building purposes, we feel needs to have some consideration in that. I would
agree very strongly, and I think my colleagues in Tringhouses and Woodthorpe would concur with that. Let alone other wards where there is a knock-on effect. So I think accepting the push is to enable infrastructure to happen more readily. There is a York context in this, and therefore I can understand some of the frustrations of institutions in bringing forward plans only to have long debates about the aesthetics of the materials. Thinking back to the debates over York St John on Gillygate and Union Terrace, but I think there are some long-standing impacts on communities that should be factored in. So, Gareth, are you happy with that to be included in the response that we give, that actually the consideration should be made?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Okay.
Moving on to the reducing the time to deal with public infrastructure applications. Obviously, there are resource implications for us in principle. We can achieve that, and we're not suggesting that that the answer to that question is no. But it would have to come alongside pre-application discussions. We feel meaningful pre-application discussions.
I think there should be, and I've had representation on this, and we've discussed this previously. That we need to see what the pre-application process would look like in order that it would answer the question: would the public know? Would somebody living close by or somebody with an interest get to find out? Because if all that happens is a superficial pre-application consultation that is easily missed, and there's a reduction in the statutory consultation, then people will feel that they've seen a reduction in democratic oversight. So
I think, Councillor Waller, that front loading that effectively you're describing is really important, isn't it? Because we're going to lose two things. We're going to be pushed to decide applications in 10 weeks, and there's going to be less time in the system for people to respond. We know sometimes people find it difficult to be able to deal with the current timescales. Clearly, it depends on the scale of the development.
It does, and by the time that people have tried to find it on the system, it can take a short while for that to happen, or contact their counsellor. So I personally, from the representations I've received, would urge that that the consultation time is not reduced, but that we might change our position if government came forward with very detailed explanation on how pre-application would work. But we would like to see that in operation first, potentially in a pilot if they're not that we're volunteering to be there, but if they do have a local authority that wanted to pilot this and to demonstrate that it worked, then we could go and ask the people who lived there what they thought about it.
As written, the pre-application questions are about making sure the authority engages in pre-application, which, as far as I can recall, we've never turned down pre-application requests from anybody, be they public authorities or otherwise. What it doesn't do,
quite the contrary. As I think we positively encourage that dialogue.
Yes, there is no mention though of that pre-application engagement involving members of the public as it stands.
Right.
So that's why we've couched our response in the way we have.
All right. So in that case, if the period of time of the public could be expected to find out about something and comment, if that's being reduced, then that is not something that the public would be in favour of.
Okay. And this proposal is for it's only in respect of major developments. So these will be things over 1,000 square metres, so significant schemes.
So I think that we would express our concern that any reduction in the ability of the public and councillors to comment.
Okay.
Okay.
And then the fourth strand, which is the consolidation of the order, we are broadly supportive of.
Right.
Dealing with 5 years of consequential amendments is a tough challenge for anyone. So bringing it all together is a good thing in our minds.
Councillor Waller, just an observation in terms of our discussion this morning about this. Clearly, the questions are the questions that have been set out by MHCLG, but obviously some of the issues I think that we have talked about aren't properly addressed by answering those questions. And I wonder, have you given thought to potentially supplementing this with a further sort of comment, shall we say?
Yes, I think as we did with the previous government consultations, there will be a covering letter from myself to cover some of the issues, the major issues raised by residents, other members and partners in relation to questions that we hoped would have been asked at this point. So yes, I shall be doing a covering letter.
I think that would be helpful. I think in terms of some of the responses to the questions, otherwise we'll be seen to be going off, not actually answering the questions because we're making other comments. So that's a good way.
Yeah.
There isn't a mechanism for, have you any other views on this really?
Yes. So I think in our York way of responding, we'll certainly pass on those views. So thank you very much for that comprehensive review. I'm sure that not every council is doing it this way, but York is a city that loves its planning processes. Right. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. So with those comments, draw that item to a close. That brings us on to item 6, urgent business. I don't have any urgent business and therefore bring the meeting to a close. Thank you all for your attendance.
Thank you, Councillor Waller.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, the live stream's now ended.